Hello and welcome back to Geek and Speak, the Geek and Seek podcast. Today, we're talking about cards that are better than you think they are. Cards that we think are maybe underrated or maybe deserve a little bit more play than they get. Maybe they're cards that used to get played. Maybe they're cards that only are played in specific decks. And we're thinking, hey, maybe they deserve a little bit more love. Join with me today is Preston. How's it going, Preston?
Going pretty good. I'm really excited about this episode. It's one of my favorite topics we've covered recently, so yeah, I'm ready to talk about it.
Heck yeah, I'm also very excited. And we also have Jason. Jason, how's it going, man?
Going pretty good. I think we're gonna have some interesting conversations about these cards. I like the list that we've put together, gentlemen.
Yes, I do too. Jason was in the group chat a couple days ago being like, I don't agree with half the cards you put on this Google Doc. So we'll have some good conversation, I think. And then, hello, I am your host, Morgan. I'm also doing really well. If I could rant for a second, though. Last episode, we talked about our favorite cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which you should go listen to that episode if you'd like. But a card that maybe one of us should have talked about is Vaultborn Tyrant. This is a new dinosaur, and I didn't mention it because I was like, oh, if you like green stompy decks, you might play this. Oh, if you like dinosaur decks, you'll probably play this because it's a big, scary dinosaur. But I'm going to be honest, guys, this card was a design mistake, and we should have talked about it in our episode. It's a 7-mana 6/6 with trample that draws cards, gains life, and it replaces itself when it dies. And I just filmed and uploaded a new gameplay that is going to be out by the time you're seeing this podcast, testing out the new Rush of Dread combo on Arena. And I was playing against a mono green devotion deck that played this. And it's so annoying because you need to use 2 removal pieces to get rid of it. But then the token, it doesn't die to Fatal Push, either it or the token copy, because the token copy keeps the mana value, so it doesn't die to Fatal Push. And then it doesn't die to Go for the Throat, which is the other main removal card. The token copy doesn't die to Go for the Throat because it's an artifact for no reason. So the fact that we didn't talk about this card is absolutely insane. But I just needed to get that rant out because I've been like, I just filmed it and then edited it, and I've just been bottling up this rage for this card. This card is a design mistake.
Well, Morgan, you need to understand, Green was really struggling and needed some power pieces.
Oh, well, when you phrase it like that, yeah. Green needed the help. I agree.
What's this card?
Vaultborn Tyrant. It's from the big score. So it's on the bonus sheet. It was supposed to be like an Aftermath style set. And then just when they decided not to do that, they just jammed it in here. So like you can get one of these cards in like one in every 7 packs or something, I think. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, isn't it dumb? It's so strong. But yeah, if you like green stompy decks or dinosaur decks, it's hard to justify not playing this outside of it's kind of expensive. I'm not sure.
Just going to say 7 mana does feel like a lot of mana, but
I meant the fact that it's $14, but yeah, but
why?
It might go down. Well, it just came out and it's a mythic. So every card in the big score is a mythic because there's only one in like every 7 packs or one in every 8 packs. And there's like, 40 cards from that set or something. So they're uber rare. And the set just came out. The main concern is that green stompy decks and dinosaur decks are also very popular, so there's a chance that this card just stays expensive. But outside of that, I mean, this is a insane card. Very cool. Very strong.
It's very interesting. I do think you do kind of get 12 damage. You know, like you get 2 bodies that have 12 damage total between the 2 of them for 7 mana. And both of them are going to draw you a card.
Yeah. Well, it's whenever it or another creature. So if it gets to stick around too, it'll draw you even more cards. It'll gain you even more life. And then the fact that the token copy keeps the mana value and is an artifact in addition to its other types is also very brutal in a format like Pioneer, where that outrules a lot of the best removal spells, as I found out.
It's green, so it can also token copies.
Yeah. There's all the doubling season kind of shenanigans that you can do with it too.
This might have to go into Gimbal now that I think about it.
Yeah, I could see maybe an argument for that.
if it's gonna make a copy of itself, like a token copy of itself, that's just another copy with that's just another token with a different name.
Yeah, that's true. And then it's just incidentally going to draw you some cards and gain you some life. And as some of the cards you'll see on our list today will see, we are all for having some incidental life gain in our decks. But before we get into our main topic, now that I got that rant over with, if you would like to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/geekandseekyoutube. And if you do that, you are directly supporting the show. And if you can't support us financially, that's fine. You can also just help us out by liking this video, leaving helpful comments, or asking questions in the comments, checking out our other videos. We have over 200 videos, all sorts of stuff. We have this podcast. We have our Commander gameplay. We have Arena gameplay, as I mentioned. We have all sorts of stuff that we're working on and more coming soon. So, yeah. And then for our favorite comment of the week, this is from Stefan. He left this comment on the companion episode of our Commander gameplay series, where all of us had a companion. And he says, I'm surprised you haven't hit it bigger on YouTube. Editing is great, and it's one of the only 3 good Commander channels other than I Hate Your Deck and Worst Possible. I think there's more good Commander shows than that, but I appreciate the sentiment, and I like that you like the content. We appreciate it. We are also surprised we haven't kicked it off farther. I think we have cool themes for our episodes, and I think the editing's pretty decent for me having to turn these around every other week or whatever.
I think we all do a pretty good job of building interesting decks and bringing interesting decks to the table whenever we have these weird and wacky themes where, like outside of the gameplays where, we're playing sets of things, like just to expose the set a little bit. I think that we try to make it interesting in our gameplay videos. But I agree. I think that there's more good channels out there than that. Also, I don't know if it's...
Don't hype up the competition. It makes us look worse.
I don't know if this guy's... Or... I don't know if this person's name is Stefan or Stefan.
Oh, I guess that's a good point. I guess it could be Stefan.
Stefan. Thank you for the comment.
Yeah. Thanks for the support. We'll be keeping it up. We do have some changes coming to our show, but we do hope to continue to grow. And yeah. So as we head into our main topic, again, we are talking about cards that are better than maybe they get credit for. These are cards that we think are underrated. So it's not that none of these cards ever get played. Some of them are either they used to be staples and they're not anymore, or they're really good in specific decks, but maybe they don't really get attention outside of those specific decks. So that's just a little bit of context going into this. And then when applicable, we will also have EDH rec data, like they're in this many decks out of this many possible decks and stuff like that, just to back up our arguments that maybe these cards are underrated. Preston, why don't you go ahead and start us off with your first card today?
All right. First up, I have Elixir of Immortality. It is a 1-cost artifact that says you can pay 2, tap it, you gain 5 life, and then you shuffle Elixir of Immortality and your graveyard into their owner's library. So I really like this card because, it's anti-graveyard hate, which a lot of people are starting to run nowadays because of how strong graveyard decks are. People are being better about running that kind of hate. So this gets around that. 5 life for basically 3 mana is pretty good. That's essentially a food token, but a little better. And it's a little more popular than I used to think it was. Apparently it's in about 1.8% of decks, so 70,000 on EDH rec, which is pretty decent, but it could be a lot higher, and I think people would get a lot of use out of it if they started running it more in some of their decks.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought was interesting about it is that it's tutorable with Urza Saga. If you're just... I don't run Urza Saga unless I have more than just a couple targets for it, because otherwise it feels like you're not really getting enough value out of it. And I don't know if this is necessarily strong enough that you're like, all right, I'm going to add this just so I can have more Urza Saga hits. But I think if you're already running Urza Saga, that maybe this is worth adding into the deck just to give you more flexibility, more options. And, this is going to, if your combo pieces get milled or destroyed, this can theoretically help you get them back. If someone goes to exile your graveyard in your graveyard deck, this protects you. So in specific decks, yeah, I actually think this card's pretty sweet.
I don't know if I would find a slot for this in every deck that I have, but I do think that most decks would just benefit from having this card in it. This is kind of one of those cards that if you just have a dead card in your deck right now, maybe switch it out for this. It can give you some options back later on in the game that you might not have had before because you used them already and now they're just sitting in your graveyard. That 5 life can mean a lot more than you might think in a pinch. The fact that you can gain that life at instant speed as long as you have 2 mana available to activate this. And another thing about it is you can loop it. If you have a way to consistently get it onto the battlefield and sacrifice it, you can just gain as much life as you need to. So there's a lot of potential for this card to get really nasty and twisted. That is definitely more deck specific if your deck is doing those types of degenerate things. But this is a really good card, and I honestly, it's a bit surprising to me that it's not in a bit more decks, even though it's colorless and can go in any deck. She does. 1.8% of all decks is pretty, that's not horrible. That's a pretty good, it's pretty decent percentage of decks. I mean, but I could still see it going in more, and I don't think that people understand just how good this card actually is for 3 mana.
Well, something really that I really like about it is that a lot of these style effects that will shuffle your graveyard back into your library, there'll be something that sacrifice a creature that dies or an instant or sorcery. So they'll go to the graveyard after they do their shuffle effect, but Elixir shuffles itself with your graveyard. So you don't have to worry about it being in there and then you can't use it anymore. It also goes back in your deck, which I like, because that's just not super common for most of those effects.
I think it's a bit more common than you're giving it credit for. Cards.
No, it
cards
definitely
it
definitely happens, but most of them I feel will go to the graveyard or exile when you're done using them.
Like Blightsteel, I'm pretty sure shuffles back into your library with your graveyard. The Eldrazi do. I think that.
Yeah, but that's not. You run those cards for a different reason than you run Elixir of Immortality.
Right.
You run Elixir of Immortality as a protection thing, whereas you're running those big scary monsters.
My point there was just I don't think that shuffling it into your library is super uncommon for cards.
Do you remember if Gaia's Blessing does that? That's a card that Preston turned me on to that I forgot about. Gaia's Blessing is, I've started running it in sideboards in a lot of my decks on Arena, just because it helps get my combo pieces out, prevents mill.
Gaia's Blessing, if you use it as a spell, it doesn't shuffle itself. You just pick 3 cards to shuffle into your library. But if it gets milled, it will shuffle itself and your graveyard into your library, which I really like as anti-mill.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I've started jamming that in all of my sideboards on Arena that can run it. The only other thing I want to add about Elixir of Immortality is that, like you said, because you can keep looping it, it does also kind of play win more. It's best as protection, but I do like the idea of I cast my big scary spell and gets value, and I'm probably already winning, but now I'm going to shuffle it back into my deck and I might get to do it again. That doesn't make this any better, but I think it's funny. I think it's fun that you can theoretically do that. I did used to run this in a couple of my decks. I kind of feel like I should put it back in. One of the decks I used to have it in was Muldrotha, and I just ended up with other ways to protect my graveyard in that deck, but I feel like it's efficient enough that maybe I should just double check. Maybe it should go back in. It's worth double checking. I'll keep that in mind.
And it's a 50-cent card, so
right. And I think I have a couple.
Everyone can run this.
Yeah, I think I still have a couple floating around in my collection, so it's not like I would even have to spend the 50 cents.
Here's the thing with it, too. The transmutation font combo that we talked about in the last episode of the podcast, you can, that allows you to infinitely loop. Elixir of Immortality, which is so funny to me.
That is pretty good. Jason, why don't you go ahead and talk to us about your first card?
Okay, so my first card is a utility land. You may have heard of it. It's called Maze of Ith. Okay, first of all, I want to go ahead and say that this card is in 3% of decks, which is a decent amount of decks, considering it's a colorless land. It can go, it doesn't actually tap for a mana, but it can go into any single deck. 3% is a lot. So I will say that. I don't see it in a ton of decks that I play against outside of decks that are super specific, like attacking with their commander, and they want to get tricky with the Maze of Ith stuff, or, they want to like maybe protect their commander from attacks or what have you. Or, if you're running a Planeswalker as your commander, people attacking your commander in combat, you can remove creatures, to help keep that Planeswalker alive longer. But I think that this card is sweet because if you have the ability to untap it, you can now start removing multiple things from combat per turn and really kind of pillow fort yourself and keep yourself alive a lot longer. Maze of Ith is such a fun card. There's a lot of really cool ways to just utilize this to help protect you or your things. It's not exactly like a fog, but sometimes it can feel like that when you remove a huge creature from combat that's going to deal a lot of damage to you. Or you can use it politically and remove a creature attacking somebody else from combat, and now that person is like not going to do anything to you because you basically saved them. Or you can make a deal with somebody and remove a creature from combat, and then you get something out of it. There's a lot of really fun ways to play this card in Commander. So I really like it. I honestly think it should be in more than 3% of all decks. I don't run it as much in my decks, but honestly, I should run it in every single deck that I have. Specifically because, you guys know me. I don't really care if a land will tap for mana if it does something really good.
Yeah. So for context, if you don't know what it is, it's a land that doesn't tap for mana, but it says tap, untap, target attacking creature, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by that creature this turn. I kind of wonder if part of why it's not more popular than it is, because 3% is nothing to scoff at if you ask me, but it used to be like a boogeyman of the format. And I wonder if part of why maybe it's not more popular is it used to be pretty expensive. But what's interesting is that there's been this switch that now it got a couple of reprints the last couple of years. So now it's like $5, so it's nowhere near as expensive as it used to be. But people are running fewer and fewer lands in their decks, I feel like. At least on like... we have people like Jason who he opens up a precon and automatically cuts 4 or 5 lands. So now having these lands that don't tap for mana, unless you're playing like Urborg or Yavimaya or Chromatic Lantern, other ways that you are somewhat consistently going to be able to tap this for mana, that is a drawback. What's really amazing about this card, though, is you usually don't even have to do it. So, like, think of, like, Ghostly Prison or Propaganda, right? These are enchantments that, like, technically, they can attack you. They can get in their damage, and you have to either decide to block or take the damage. But people will just, like, until they have a lethal board, they just will not attack you. They just don't want to use the mana. So they'll just go attack someone else. And that's how Maze of Ith plays. Maze of Ith will often, your opponent will see an untapped Maze of Ith, and say, well, I don't want to not get my value from attacking. So I guess I'm just not going to attack them. So a lot of the time you don't even have to activate it. And that will just go around the table. Opponent 1, opponent 2, opponent 3, they'll all say that to themselves. And no one attacked you because you have this untapped Maze of Ith. So the threat of activation is what gets...
To go along with that, they decide they don't want to attack you and they're going to attack somebody else so that they can get as much value as they can out of their, they'll attack somebody else with their creature that's equipped with the Sword of Feast and Famine and get through for combat damage. But you could still remove that creature from combat so they don't get that advantage. Even if it's not attacking you, you could still do that. Just to prevent them from getting, like, in that type of situation, it's almost like it's like neutralizing, as long as it's untapped, it's almost neutralizing the best creature on the best attacking creature on everyone's board. And that's one of the really cool things about it is without even doing anything, like it sits on the table, it has the potential to effectively shut off everyone's best creature.
Another thing it does is you can use it to save your own creature. Like if you swing in and then they have a combat trick, like that's not the main reason you're on Maze of Ith, but it is a nice little utility aspect to it, I feel like.
The whole thing behind this card is utility. That's like it's just the best utility land that exists. In my personal opinion, I think this is the best utility land out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I really do think it is like the old price tag it used to have. I think a lot of people just don't realize how cheap it's gotten. And also, there's a lot less singular big creatures than there used to be, I feel like. Nowadays, people
aggressive
can way
strategies are more
easier.
Well, they're more common
People
than they
still
used to
have
be.
aggressive strategies, but now it's just so easy to make 1,000 things that are going in to swing at your opponents. You don't need one big creature as much anymore. So that has brought it down in part, but it's still a really good card.
Yeah, and one of the episodes for the podcast we are going to do is we're going to talk about our favorite utility lands. It will be interesting to see if Jason still holds it at number 1 after we make our lists and finalize it and film that episode. So stay tuned for that. But the more I think about it, I think Preston's right. I think the reason people aren't playing this is because they still think it's expensive, even though it's not anymore. Because the more I think about it, this card has just gotten better over time. Because we have, like I said, we have Chromatic Lantern, Urborg Galvamaya. Those cards have been around for a while. They'll let you tap your lands for mana. But we even have other ones. We have the Dryad of Elysian Grove, and there's one of those land creatures from the Warhammer precons. We're getting more and more ways.
World Tree.
Yeah, we have the World Tree. We're getting more and more ways that your lands, even if they don't, will just tap for all your colors. If these other cards are set up to help them do that. And that takes away the one downside of Maze of Ith is that it's a land drop that doesn't add mana. And we are constantly getting more and more good non-basic land tutors. Like just a few episodes ago, we talked about Archdruid's Charm from Urza Karlov Manor. It's instant speed. It does a lot, but the main mode that's relevant right now is that it can grab a non-basic land and slap it onto the battlefield. And we have a ton of those. Crop Rotation's an old card, Attempt with Discovery, but we're getting more and more of these cards. And so I feel like Maze of Ith is just going to keep getting better. Maybe Voltron not being as popular of a archetype as it used to be, maybe that's something to keep in mind, but maybe Maze of Ith is just still getting better over time.
That's kind of my point with putting it on this list. I think that even though it's in 3% of decks, which considering it could go into any deck, 3% is a lot. I will keep saying that. I acknowledge it is a lot of decks. It could still be in more. Like, there's no reason why this card shouldn't be in more decks just as a utility land, because there's so many cool ways to use this in combat. And just like you're saying, all the abilities of cards now that exist that can just give this ways to tap for mana, it needs to be in more than 3% of decks. I need to start putting it into all of my decks personally. This can go into just about any deck, because if you think about big swinging creature decks, you could use this to protect your creature. You could use this to stop other people from attacking you. You could use it to... There's different ways you could use it in a creature deck. And then if you think about a deck that doesn't have a whole lot of creatures, like a Spellslinger's deck, now you're using this as just straight up protection. I'm saving this for if that creature pointing at the biggest, baddest creature on the board swings at you. So there's utility for this in just about any deck.
Yeah.
If your deck has the Monarchy, you should definitely run Maze of Ith to protect it.
Good point. Yeah. I love the Monarch. I haven't quite gotten to this point, but I've almost got to the point where I've put at least one Monarch card in all of my decks just because I love playing with it. I'm not quite there, but pretty close. Okay, so my first card for today is Natural Affinity. To give you some perspective, this is in 0% of possible decks. It's only in a little over 4,000 decks, according to EDH Rec. Natural Affinity is from Arcadian Masks and was reprinted in 9th edition. For 2 and a green, it's an instant that says all lands become 2/2 creatures until end of turn. They are still lands. So I have this in 2 of my decks. Those 2 decks are my land destruction deck, because someone casts a board wipe or something, you cast this in response, and then all of the lands will also die to the board wipe. That's just hilarious, because as the person who is the land destruction deck, I will rebuild from that way better than my opponents will. So that's a good way to just swing the game. But then I also have it in my Jalriel deck, which is a Simic deck that cares about creature lands. So this is a good way to just get a bunch of creature lands, draw a bunch of cards off of my commander. However, I kind of think that it's probably a little bit better than that, because think about just the stereotypical mono green deck, right? You are land ramp, land ramp, land ramp, land ramp, and on turn 5 you have 29 basic lands on the battlefield, right? Then this is just a finisher. Then let's say you also have a Soul Ring or something, right? So then you're only putting yourself down 1 land, and then you're using all of your other lands to go wide, and there's a decent chance that you can just win the game from there. And the fact that this is just till end of turn, a lot of these like go wide plans get blown out by board wipes, right? If I secure the Waste or something, or Martial Coup or something like that, and just make a bunch of tokens, go wide, and I plan on winning the game that way, board wipe blows you out. Natural Affinity, though, is going to get around that, because it's only until end of turn, then they just go back to being your lands. It's also, because it's an instant, you can do the thing where I mentioned where you can do it in response to things. Like the board wipe situations may be a little extreme. Not many decks are going to want to do that. But you can use it as a way to have surprise blockers. Your opponents aren't going to be expecting that. And then there is the added upside of if you have lands that are indestructible. You know, there's artifact dual lands that are indestructible, or there's the Darksteel Ingots or whatnot. There's a handful of indestructible lands. Or if you're just a graveyard deck and you're very easily going to be able to play your lands from your graveyard. I think just a lot of landfall decks in general, that's going to be true for. Like if you're playing Lord Windgrace or something, and you have some way to play additional land drops, well, you're going to be able to play your additional land drops from your graveyard too. So even if you use the Natural Affinity and you're going to lose some of your lands, you're just going to get them back. So I feel like, you know, the fact that this is in 0% of decks according to EDH Rec is kind of ridiculous, because it's so flexible. I think there is a possibility, because this hasn't gotten reprint since the year 2000, 2005. There's a good chance that a lot of people just don't even know this card exists. But I feel like it's really funny in those 2 decks I have it in. But I think a lot of green decks should just consider it anyways.
I will say Natural Affinity is, I did the math real quick, and it is in 0.0024% of all commander decks listed on EDH Rec. That is the least played card that we're going to be talking about today. So people need to start playing this card more. I would need to actually look at the deck and see what exactly I used. But there was a couple weeks ago, or a couple episodes of Upkeep ago, when I turned all my lands into creatures and then played Triumph of the Hordes and gave them all Infect. And
oh yeah,
I didn't
you played
win
the
that
one.
game.
You played the one that had Entwing or whatever. Where you untapped all of them and then they turned into creatures. Yeah. It was that one, whatever that one's called.
This is just as good as that, in my opinion. It doesn't untap them, but it costs less mana. And if you have a bunch of lands on the battlefield, you're going to just immediately put a ton of power out there. That's going to do a lot of damage. So you could honestly use this card as a win condition paired with something like, a Triumph of the Hordes, or if you pair it with like a Craterhoof Behemoth, because only being 3 mana to do this, you should still have a lot of mana available to you to play something else that's big. And I would like to think that in Commander, you don't necessarily have to use your lands to get access to the mana to play these things. If you're in a lands deck, maybe you don't care as much because you have 25 lands out onto the battlefield. So, you spend 3 mana on this and then 8 mana on something else. You still got over 10 lands to work with. So...
Well, you do also turn your creatures or your opponent's lands into creatures. It says all lands become creatures, not just yours.
Mm-hmm.
So
but
it is a little worse than some of those other effects in that regards.
So that is relevant. However, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of our play group, and I think our play group is more or less the norm. That we are not leaving up a lot of interaction. We might leave up the 1 mana for the Path to Exile. We might leave up the double blue for Counterspell, but we are not leaving up a ton of interaction. We're not leaving up a lot of our mana. Yeah. Like maybe you're leaving up the Teferi's Protection. If you're really scared of dying, you'll leave up Teferi's Protection. But like people are not, they're not going to play around this. And then even if you are turning your opponent's lands into creatures, most of them are going to be tapped. So
I think that just thinking about it, I think the most mana any one of us in an episode has kept up to play spells is when I held 9 mana up to play Gandalf and then the One Ring. I think that's the most mana any one of us has held up for anything, and it wasn't even for like a Cyclonic Rift. It was for something a little bit...
A game-winning play.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely the game-winning play, but I just love it for the flavor of it. You know what I mean? Gandalf into the One Ring.
Yeah. That was pretty good.
This card's sweet. I honestly really like it.
There is one more reason why it doesn't get played a lot. There's
White
5
border?
printings up. Yeah, well, there's 5 printings of it. The 2 that look good are over $10, and the 3 that look like dog water are all about $1. So
I wonder why.
Do you want to spend $9 more so that you get a version that doesn't look terrible?
What's wrong with the Marcadian masks?
Or 8th edition.
Nah, white border looks ugly, and that old frame looks ugly. I'm sorry I have to tell you this.
People just need to get over it. Get over it. Get over it. It's a card. It does the same thing no matter how much it costs.
It's a piece of history, Preston. You're just not appreciating it. All right, Preston, why don't you go ahead and talk to us about your second card?
All right. My second card is Oketra's Last Mercy. It's 1, 2 white for a sorcery. Your life total becomes equal to your starting life total. Lands you control don't untap during your next untap step. This card is currently in 0.0872% of decks that it's available in, so 1,543. And I just don't know why people don't play this more. It can take you from like 1 life all the way up back to 40. That's such a huge end of game bonus to me that like I just don't know why people don't run this more. I use this card all the time to save myself in dire situations and pull me back from the brink. It's just such a good card. It's less than $1 in both of its printings. So I really do think people need to start playing this more often.
Yeah, I remember this was fairly new when you got into Magic. And I remember you were running it in the first draft of your life gain deck, which was your first commander deck. Does this count as actually gaining life? It does count as gaining life. That does make it better if you have just like a life gain deck. Maybe it's often a dead card in your life gain deck because you might have 100 life and then you don't want to go to your starting. But it's something you can hold on to until it looks like your opponent might take you out, and then you're like, ha, and then you'll incidentally trigger all your life gain cards as well. So it is pretty good. It is, obviously it's not as good as something like a Teferi's Protection, which is also 3 mana and that saves you. This obviously is not as good because your lands aren't going to untap. It's at sorcery speed. your opponent's board might be scary enough that they're like, okay, I just need one more turn and I'll just kill you again anyways. But I do think that it's better than the less than 1%. I mean, I don't know. People like their life gain decks. I feel like it should at least be in a lot of the life gain decks.
I think that this card is a lot better than 0.0872% of all decks. It's only in 1,500 decks that it could possibly go in. This card, for 3 mana, any card that has the potential to gain you 39 life for 3 mana is worth putting into any deck, in my opinion. If you're not playing life gain, like if that's not the strategy that you want to go with, I don't know why you don't run this card. Because imagine it's the late game and everybody's at 20, 15, 10, somewhere around their life. You play this for 3 mana and then you pass the turn. Those 3 lands aren't going to untap during your next untap step. But now you're 20 life, 25 life ahead of everybody. You could probably afford to just sacrifice 1 rotation of the table, and maybe they all go at you to try and knock you down because you gained all this life. Maybe they keep working on the game plan that they had and it gets back to you and you still have 40 life or 36 life or something like that. That's such an advantage to have in a game of Commander. So I think that if you play this card right in the right situations, I don't think that necessarily that your lands don't untap is going to be as detrimental to you. But I still think that even with the lands not untapping, this card is still going to be able to find a slot into most white decks or decks that just have white in it because of the potential. It has the potential to gain you 39 life for 3 mana. That's huge.
You can pair this with the 20 different white board wipes where you keep stuff on your battlefield, but your opponents don't. So they're all still at low life totals. You just went back up to starting, and you still have a board state. You don't get to have a next turn probably when you spend that much mana, but you might not need to.
Yeah, it is worth mentioning that you want to make sure you have the board state to back it up. If you're in the losing position, you might not have that. But if you cast this and all 3 of your opponents are still alive, you're probably in a bad position because they will just use all of their resources to arch enemy you. So you need to make sure you at least have plenty of blockers and stuff. But outside of that, I still think that's maybe worth it at least sometimes. But you can also get around the lands don't untap thing if you have something like Wilderness Reclamation, or if you have a bunch of mana rocks, or if you have treasure tokens. So there's ways around it too that you can still like develop your game plan while also technically not having your lands on tap.
I think about funny stuff with this card, like if somebody plays Worldfire. I don't know why anyone would in Commander, but if somebody played a Worldfire and then the next 3 turns you go land, and then after that 3rd turn you go Oketra's Last Mercy, and everybody's at 1 life and you're at 40. That feels pretty good.
Yeah, but if you're using if you're playing Worldfire, you are playing with the intention of it's a game-winning spell.
No, I'm
so
saying
I don't think you get the 3 more lands.
Somebody else.
Well, I know, but I'm saying I think if someone casts that, you're doomed anyways because they have some kind of sneaky shenanigans to kill you before you get to the 3 lands anyways for you to even cast this.
Worldfire exiles everything, so maybe they do, maybe they don't. But I just think of that funny situation where, 3 turns after the Worldfire is cast, all your opponents are at 1 life and you're at 40. That
would be beautiful.
I'll consider putting it in a deck. But Jason, why don't you go ahead and talk to us about your number 2 card?
Okay, so my next card is a card that I want to put this into more decks. It's hard for me to find cards to cut, but it's Crafty Cutpurse. This is a 2/2 human pirate with flash, and it's 3 and 1 blue. And it says, when it enters the battlefield, each token that would be made under an opponent's control this turn is created under your control instead. Holy cow, guys. With the amount of token generation that is prevalent in Magic right now, the fact that this card is only in about 1% of all decks that it can go in is kind of shocking to me. I really think that this card has a lot more value, like it has a lot more face value than other people might think. I mean, if somebody has a Smothering Tithe on the battlefield and then another player has a huge draw spell, or even if you play a huge draw spell and then you follow it up with this, you basically made that draw spell pay for itself. Or you're now taking advantage of somebody else's Smothering Tithe that they no longer, get to utilize. It's only for one turn, but the thing with blue, flicker. Not necessarily saying that that's what you want to do with this card, play it and then flicker it. But you could absolutely do that because it has that enter the battlefield, like it triggers when it enters the battlefield. This card is sweet, and I want to slot it into more decks, but it's hard for me to find things to cut out to put it in for. But man, I just think about situations like somebody plays a Dockside and they're going to make 15 treasure tokens. But wait a minute.
Thank you.
So I think that this is a card that's going to keep getting better. I think when it was printed, it was just like, fine. Maybe this is like a metagamey card. Like, I have friends in my play group who play token decks, so I'm going to put this in my deck. Or I think it was intended to be like a sideboard card when it was printed in standard. I don't think it got any play, though. I will say, because we've leaned so far into treasure stuff and then copy tokens and blah, 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 I think this is a card that keeps getting better over time, and it's probably going to keep getting better in the future. But I don't know if it's quite good enough that you just randomly jam this in your blue decks for value, though. I think it's probably better than the 0. whatever % of decks it's in. Like, if you're playing pirates, if you're playing humans, if you're playing maybe certain control shells might like it. If you're playing flicker decks, then yeah, I'm all for it. I'm like, in all of those decks, this is pretty good. But outside of that, I don't know if it's quite good enough to just auto-include in blue decks.
I'm going to put this in my Simic deck and pair it with Curse of Swine. So I exile all their creatures and then
you get the swines. Yeah, that's good.
Of all the cards we've talked about so far, it's the one I'm probably least likely to put in decks, but I could definitely see it being pretty good, especially depending on your meta. So, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah, I might start trying to throw it in a couple decks here and there if I can find a space for it. Because it does cost 4, and it's just a 2/2, so, like, you gotta make sure you really have something good to do with it, but...
I like this card a lot. All the fun stuff that you could do with it, I just like it.
So obviously you want it in your pirate deck that you have, right, Jason? But do you have it in any of your other decks, or?
Not currently. I haven't been building a ton of blue decks lately, to be honest with you.
I mean, yeah, every single set that comes out gives us 15 more treasure cards, so it's just going to keep getting better.
Yeah, it's one I'll keep an eye on. So my next card is a card that I think a lot of people know because it used to be a staple. This is Mind's Eye. For 5 mana, it's an artifact that says whenever an opponent draws a card, you may pay 1. If you do, you draw a card. This is in about 1% of all decks, so it's in about 37,000 decks according to EDH Rec. This used to be my daughter is playing, so hopefully that music doesn't distract anyone too bad. But this used to be like an uber staple in like colorless decks and mono white decks for card draw, specifically because we didn't have the power creepy hyper fixated on commander design that we have today. So there was a period of time where this card was really good, but as we've power crept commander specifically, this card has just kind of fallen out of favor with a lot of people. Just there's other ways to draw cards in other colors now. Even a lot of colorless decks don't even play this anymore. But I gotta say, guys, I had a commander clash this card still comes down every now and then. Everyone's like, oh, look at the boomer playing Mind's Eye. And then everyone ignores it because it doesn't seem like a threat. And they just draw all of the cards. Jason made the point that it's never efficient on curve, which is correct. It's 6 mana to draw 1. It's 7 mana to draw 2. Like, there's never a point where you're like, oh, that mana investment was great. But it is an artifact, and there's a lot of ways to cheat artifacts into play, so that's worth mentioning. And then it because it's so not a threat, it just sticks around, and you'll just draw all of the cards. So I do agree that a lot of decks don't necessarily want this, but I think 1% of decks is too low, even though this used to be an uber staple, just because, like I said, because it's an artifact, there's a lot of ways to cheat into play. If you are a deck that's consistently leaving mana up for other things, this is a good thing to sink your mana into. And it's just not going to draw a lot of ire. I mean, it dies to Farewell or Austere Command or whatever, right? But I feel like it's still okay. And at least a good chunk of decks, more than 1% of decks.
And there's a good chance a lot of those decks are people's old lists that they just never took off.
Right, yeah. So who even knows how many of those 1% of decks are decks that are still in existence? Yeah.
I think that this card is bad. That's just me. I'm sorry. I'm not going to play this in any deck because it's 5 mana, and, the only decks that I could see playing it in are...
Oh, come on, Jason. There's got to be some.
Colorless artifact decks where you're cheating artifacts onto the battlefield. This is a pretty good card for that deck.
Yeah, like Duretti, the mono red Duretti.
Yeah, that's good with that. Decks that, really it's just mono red if you're looking for straight up card draw, because now every other color has a pretty decent way to draw cards for what those colors want to do. It's not the worst card ever. I see why it's in 1% of all decks. It does have some use, and it does have potential to draw you 3-4 cards on one turn if you have the mana to do that. It's really like kind of reverse heuristic study if you think about it. Instead of your opponents paying mana to stop you from drawing cards, you pay mana to enable you to draw cards. It's kind of the opposite in that sense, but I think that this card is better than I give it credit for. I'm just not a big fan.
Yeah. I only have like 2, maybe 3 decks that I've considered running it in, but I don't know. Especially this season of editing Commander Clash, I'm like, oh god, maybe this card actually is good. But what do you think, Preston?
Yeah, like, I do have my mono red Goblins deck. I don't think I currently have this in there. I'll probably go and put it in there at some point just because that deck really needs some card draw. And yeah, if you're playing a colorless deck specifically, I don't know why you wouldn't include this. Like, because it's not going to cost 5 probably in that deck. Like, there's so many things in colorless that, like, lower the cost of colorless cards at this point. You can play it for, like, 2 or 3 probably. So, yeah, like, it's super cheap to get out in those kind of decks. Red really appreciates something to draw cards with. So, it has its uses, but...
And the red decks often have the artifact synergies to help you get in for faster. There's a couple goblins specifically, like you were talking about goblins. There are a couple goblins specifically that are like sacrifice a artifact, get an artifact into your onto the battlefield. Which, if you just have treasure tokens lying around, sack one of those, get this back. And because a lot of red card advantage is the looting or the rummaging, this might just end up in your graveyard accidentally. Wombo combo. We just built the new mono red deck. I do think that it's been power crept out of mono white. It used to be a mono white staple. I don't think it's that anymore. I think white has gotten good enough at card draw that it probably doesn't need this anymore. But I think a lot of red decks probably specifically want this, especially if you're one of those people like Preston or Steven who really don't like the impulse draw effects. I feel like this is probably good there. And I think a good chunk of colorless decks still want it. Yeah. Preston, go ahead and talk to us about your last card.
All right. Last up, we have Cavern Harpy. It is a blue and black creature. It's a harpy beast with flying. It's a 2/1. It says when it comes into play, you return a blue or black creature you control to its owner's hand, and then also you can pay 1 life, return Cavern harpy to its owner's hand. This is just a slam dunk little creature for your Demir like ETB decks. Like it with like I have my Geigen deck, the Gyruda deck. This is a slam dunk in there. It's repeatable. It's a 2/1 flyer, so it's a good blocker against flyers if you need that sometimes, because you can block, pay the 1 life, return it to your hand. So it's just super good utility. And for those kind of decks that's repeatable, it's pretty cheap. I just really like this card, and it's currently in, let me see here, 0.2974% of decks, so 2,935 of all the possible Dimir decks are on EDH rec, so it's not played almost at all. Really good in my opinion. I think this card should be played a lot more.
Well, that's not just Dimir decks. That's decks that have black and blue in it. So that's like the 3 colors, the 4 color, 5 color decks. Like that includes all of those. The one downside of this card is it doesn't have flash. If it had flash, then I think if it had flash, it would be in a lot more than just 2.974% of decks. But even though it doesn't have flash, it'd still be in more than 0.2974% of decks. Being able to return creatures to your hand is really powerful, especially if they're going to have a powerful enter the battlefield trigger that you get to utilize again. And because, like you said, Preston, this is repeatable, you don't have to pay any mana to get it back into your hand. You just have to pay life. You could just grind out value from this creature, and then one more really good enters the battlefield creature, and just overwhelm your opponents with the value that you're getting just from those 2 cards. There is a lot of potential for this card as far as like comboing on your turn. I wish it had flash, but I don't think that takes away from how strong this card actually is.
This makes it a lot more narrow, but something I think is worth noting is that you can pay that life over and over and over again and hold priority and set your life total to something. So there are like, there's a handful of black cards that are like, when you pay life, do this. And this will field those cards. And then also if you have like that enchantment that's, it says like at the beginning of your upkeep, if your life total is 1, you win the game. You can do this. If this is in play and you have that enchantment, just do that on the end step right before it goes to your turn. Hi. My daughter's trying to talk.
Life totals.
Yeah. So there are like those kind of things. But when I see this card, I mean, obviously it's really good in your Gyruda deck. But I was like, this has to be a Yarok staple. Like Yarok is like one of those Panharmonicon-y, but it's in Sultai colors. And it's only in, according to EDH Rec, it's only in 2.05% of Yarok decks. That just seems wrong.
It does seem
like,
wrong.
It's gotta be like, do people just not know about this card? It's only been printed once and then one time on the list.
It's gotta be the reason. People just don't know that this card exists.
Because it's 15 cents. It's not like it's one of those old cards that's weirdly expensive. Like, anyone can go pick a copy of this up for any budget reason. So, like, yeah, I just think this card is amazing at what it wants to do in the decks where it's good, and people need to run it more.
Also, Pauper legal.
It is. I don't know if that's relevant. Well, actually, there is a Blink deck in Pauper. I don't think it plays black, but maybe this is good enough that you splash black just to play this thing. There is a Blink deck in Pauper. There was something else I was going to say about this card. It's gone. Yeah, no, I think it's also maybe worth considering in just some other decks outside of the ones we already mentioned, just because the format is sped up enough that a lot of our creatures just have to have incidental value immediately. Like a lot of our creatures just have entered the battlefield, do a thing. And yeah, we hope that we get to keep it around to attack and block, but everyone's playing 29 board wipes in their decks and, whatever. We can't really rely on combat much anymore. So just if your deck is in these colors and you notice that a lot of your creatures fit that criteria, this might just be worth adding for extra value.
And then on the back end of it, it's a 2/1 with flying that you can return it to your hand at instant speed for without paying mana. Honestly, that's pretty good on its own. Like, if it just was a 2/1 with flying for 1 blue, 1 black, and it had that pay 1 life, return it to your hand, that's good enough to be a card.
I think so. I mean,
so-
I think it would be a lot worse than it would get even
Well,
less
of
play than this
course, you're
does.
taking an ability off of the card. Of course, it's going to make it a lot worse. My point is, it would be good enough to run in decks just with those abilities, and then you have the the ETB trigger where you can bounce a blue or a black creature to your hand.
Now, I will say you do have to bounce something. It's not a may. You do have to bounce a creature. So if you don't have anything else, it will bounce itself. So it's kind of like the bounce lands in that way. But that also means it's like the bounce lands where you can intentionally bounce it with its own trigger and get value from it that way, which I like.
So, like, it would be expensive mana wise, I guess, to do this. But if you had like a Soul Warden on the battlefield, you could just 2 mana to gain a life.
Yeah, that's not the
And,
best
like,
use
if
of
your
your mana,
creature ETBs
but there are
leaves the
things that do
battlefield.
that, yeah. Or there are like effects that are like when a creature leaves the battlefield, like drain an opponent, stuff like that. So, yeah, I think this card's sweet. Jason, why don't you go ahead and walk us through your last card for today?
All right, so my last card, it's a card that I think is really powerful ever since I first found out about it. It's called Dauthi Embrace. So it's an enchantment for 2 and a black, and it says black, black, target creature gains shadow until end of turn. That ability is super powerful in a lot of really slept on ways. First of all, you have the ability to give your creatures evasion at instant speed. Basically, Shadow So Shadow is the creature that has Shadow. It can't be blocked, and it can only block other creatures with Shadow. Most of the time, Shadow reads this creature can't be blocked. In majority of Commander games where you play cards that have Shadow, that card might as well just read this creature can't be blocked. Also, it can't block unless another creature has Shadow. This enchantment is so powerful in a lot of really different ways. So utilizing it on your own creatures is one thing. You can use this in a lot of tricky ways at instant speed on your opponent's creatures. Let's say one opponent is going to die to let's say that like you're in an arch enemy type of situation, and one of the players needs to get one creature through to kill the arch enemy. This card allows you to do that. You can also hose your opponents in certain situations. Like, let's say something happens where two players agree that, like, I'll attack you if you block and kill it. It's like, yeah, I can do that. Like, okay, they go to do that. You give the creature Shadow. Now they don't get a block and do any of their weird combat stuff that they wanted to do. This also affects, this is also committing a crime. You're also committing a crime. So this now plays into that new thing from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. There's just a lot of really fun ways to utilize this, especially because it's an instant speed ability. You don't have to do it at sorcery speed. It is only being played in 0.0034% of all decks that it could go in. That's the second least played card that we are going to talk about today. And I think this, more than Natural Affinity, should be played in more decks. Not that I think that it's... I do think that this is objectively better than Natural Affinity, just, at face value, what it does and the potential of what you have to do with it. But I do think both those cards should be in way more decks than they're currently in.
Yeah. I guess the main gripe I would say is, well, it's almost $5. I'm not sure how that's possible, other than that it's only been printed the one time. The only other downside is that if you want to do it a lot, it requires a lot of mana and intense black pips specifically. But especially if you're a mono black deck and you have like the coffers, you're fine. You can do it.
I don't think 2 black pips is that restrictive. If you're doing it multiple times, like you're saying, then absolutely. But even then, I mentioned this in the last episode of the podcast. I think that there are enough just generically good things that will add mana of any color, that if you're playing in a 2-color deck, it should be fine because you only have 2 colors that possible to work with. But even in those 3 or 4-color decks, you're probably going to have a good amount of things that tap for any color. So activating this at least once or twice shouldn't be too difficult for most decks. That's just the way that I see it, though.
I do like that you can use it politically. Like, you could do it to your opponent's creatures. That is going to be relevant. I would play this specifically if I had like a Voltron deck that had black, because now you can just use all your equipment and aura slots to just make your commander even scarier. And then, well, what are the odds that they're not going to be able to block that?
I run this in a couple of my decks that have black in it, but the premier deck that this card is in is Dragon.
That's scary. Yeah.
I will say, it could just be our play group. I do think people are playing more shadow creatures nowadays because that not being able to block is nice. So being able to give yourself a shadow blocker actually can be a thing sometimes, especially with Dauthi Voidwalker being
that is a very popular card.
I think that you make an excellent point.
If you can afford that card, you normally put that in your black deck. So having the ability to turn any creature into a blocker for that is pretty nice.
Mm-hmm.
Not the purpose of the card, but a nice little utility thing.
Or the one that's more common in our play group is the Looter Ilkor, which is the blue one that loots when it deals combat damage and has shadow. A lot of us play that in quite a few of our decks. So it is relevant. It's just like a 1/2 or whatever. It's not even like you're like, oh, I can't take the damage, but it's like, I just don't want to give you the card.
You can block the creature and kill it.
Yeah,
in my opinion, is the thing you want.
And not give your opponent the card advantage from looting. So
especially if those creatures have been goaded and they have to attack. Now, even if they don't attack you, you can give somebody else's creature the ability to block and kill it. Lot of utility with this card. I think it's really, really powerful.
Yeah, I think my mono black deck needs this.
Yeah, Jason's been going on about this card for a couple of years, and every time he mentions it, I'm like, yeah, this card's epic. Why do I not run it in any of my decks? I don't really have a good excuse. I think if you're like a combat deck or a Voltron-y deck, an enchantment deck, just a mono black deck in general, I could go on. This could just go in a ton of decks. It's a good political card, too.
I think this should be in a majority of mono black decks. Because I don't see why you wouldn't run it in a mono black deck. In most mono black decks, I really don't see why you wouldn't have this card slotted somewhere.
Yeah, I'm gonna be holding a junior for my last card. So my last card is actually a batch of cards. This is a batch of cards that everyone knows. It's not like no one plays these, but they do not get the love and attention they deserve, and that is basic lands. Everyone, it's not like there are very few decks that don't at least have a couple basic lands, but I think people are running too many non-basics, and it's at the point where there's retaliation against it. Going back to me editing Commander Clash, our Discord group is always going off about it's time to start running more Ruinations and cards like that. Just hate out all of these cards that get a ton of non-basics into play, like Open the Way, Crop Rotation. Everyone hates Field of the Dead, and then mana fixing's just gotten too good. We have so many good dual lands now, and we have the Triumphs and all that. I know in Commander people feel ucky about targeting lands, but we're at the point where we kind of have to. How else are you going to nerf the green decks? The green decks are ramping so crazily that what else are you going to do? You have to start nerfing the green decks. So we have to deal with lands, but it also feels bad when you do cast the Ruination or whatever. So a good way to get around that is playing more basic lands. But then one of the better answers that we found, there's a green sorcery that says, like, everyone sacrifices all their non-basics, but then gets to find that many basics to put into play. And then there's that board wipe that we talked about a few episodes ago on the podcast that says exile all creatures. It's like a mega overloaded path to exile kind of thing. If people keep running those cards to hate out all the non-basics, you're screwed. But if you are running an appropriate amount of basics in your deck, you will recover just fine. And then on the surface, basics aren't that bad, and they let you play good cards. You know, I know that a lot of people are off of the 3 mana ramp these days with cards like Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, Rampant Growth, that kind of effect. But I still think that those are pretty good. But I still think that those are pretty good because not only are they giving you a land into play, but they're also going to guarantee your next land drop because they're putting a basic into your hand as well. So, and they're always going to come in untapped. And they're always going to tap for a color. A lot of utility lands, even if they come in untapped, they're going to only tap for colorless mana, which is fine until you have like a 3 to 5 color deck. And then all of a sudden it gets a little bit sus. Not that I don't run any utility lands in my 3 to 5 color decks, but I run a lot fewer than I do in my 1 and 2 color decks, right? So I just think that basic lands are underrated.
I think that you and I have had a couple conversations about mana bases and whatnot, and I think most of the time that we've talked about it, we've come to the conclusion, and we always say this at the end of whenever we have these talks. Run more basics. Sometimes we'll say it jokingly and we'll laugh, but honestly, that is the solution to most of the problems that people have when they're building decks. If they're playing it and they're like, I don't seem to hit the colors that I need when I need them, the best solution for that is going to just be probably run more basics. That's going to be a lot more helpful for making sure that you're hitting your mana on curve when you need to.
Oh, I was going to say, as someone who wants Magic players to be better at the game, I agree with you two. However, as someone whose favorite card is Settle the Wreckage, I want you both to shut up. Let them run all the utility lands they want. That way I get to blow them out and they don't get their basics. Or when I cast Price of Progress, they deal 50 damage to them. So, like...
That is a pretty good win con these days.
Selfishly, I don't want you two to say anything like this. But as a player who wants people to be better, you guys are right. People need to run more basics.
Or you just play Blood Moon and give them all mountains.
Yep.
Yeah, I do have Blood Moon in my Goblin deck.
And the other thing is that part of it is just a dual land thing. Like, for the most part, I don't really care that people are running dual lands. It's more of the scary utility lands that are the problem. But, you can still get your fixing by playing these basic land cards like the Rampant Growth and the Cultivates. And there's even more crazy ones. Like, there's that one that's from Amonkhet that says find a number of basics equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. There's that one. That one's insane. Or there's a 5 mana one that says like find a number of basics to put on the battlefield equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Like, there's a lot of really strong basic land ramp cards. If you are running enough of those, they fix you the way that a dual land would anyways.
And just how many things your opponents are going to run that say, do this thing to your stuff, make them go get a basic. Those are so rampant in the format.
Another card that... we could include this in a different list for a different episode, but Jahiria's Respite. I don't know if you guys know that card. That's the fog that you search for basics. So it's 5 mana. It's 4 to green, and you search for X basic land cards where X is the number of creatures attacking you, and then you put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then you prevent all combat damage.
I do like that.
It's really good. I run that in a couple of decks.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Maya, thanks for making those last couple of minutes a little complicated, but that's okay. That's what they're for.
Baby.
Well, thanks for hopping on, guys. Talk about some cards we think are underrated. To the listeners, let us know what you think in the comments. Do you think that any of these cards are appropriately appropriately rated? Do you think that maybe some of these cards even suck? Or do you just have some other cards that you think are worth highlighting? Are you like, oh, hey, here's a card that I think is underrated that we should put some more attention on? So, I'm out of breath. Tune in next week for another episode of the podcast. And then, while you're waiting, you can also check out some of our other content. We also have a new Commander gameplay episode coming out in just a couple days. So we will see you guys later. Bye.